The shout tore through the low hum of the service office like a sudden crack of thunder. "You're useless now! Move!" The man's voice was sharp, brimming with contempt, his finger stabbing the air toward the old soldier at the counter. He was younger, broad-shouldered under a maroon hoodie, jaw tight, eyes narrowed in the kind of glare that looks for weakness. Christopher White, 78 years old, stood still, one hand resting on the counter, the other tightening around the curved handle of his cane. The cane did not shake from frailty, but from the quiet effort it took to keep his composure. The fluorescent lights above bleached the room in a cold, sterile glow. A printer chattered behind the counter, spitting out papers no one moved to collect. People in line turned toward the commotion, some with curiosity, some with discomfort. A mother drew her little boy close, whispering something only he could hear. Christopher's reply was calm, his voice steady but carrying the weight of steel. "I'm next in line." The man stepped closer, heat radiating from him. "I said now!" His hand twitched toward Christopher's shoulder, and that was when the measured sound of footsteps began to echo across the tile. Polished black shoes, navy trousers with a crisp scarlet stripe, brass gleaming under the sterile lights. The man walking toward them carried the gravity of someone who had commanded silence in places where silence meant survival. Captain George Coleman had entered the room. Christopher did not turn to look, but his eyes shifted, almost imperceptibly, toward the sound. If you believe every veteran deserves respect, subscribe, because every view helps this message reach those who need it most. Earlier that morning, light slid through the thin curtains, casting long stripes across the modest kitchen. Christopher White stood by the counter, one hand braced against it as he poured coffee into a mug worn smooth by decades of use. The faded emblem of the 3rd Infantry Division was barely visible now, the once bright blue dulled to the shade of a sky before rain. The steam curled upward, carrying the scent of strong roast, the kind he had brewed every morning for as long as he could remember. He moved without hurry, each step measured, the quiet creak of his knees greeting the cool linoleum floor. Outside the small window above the sink, the garden waited. Rows of tomato plants stood like old comrades, their leaves trembling gently in the breeze. Christopher opened the back door and stepped out into the morning air, the coolness brushing his face. He knelt, slowly, carefully, to pinch away a wilted leaf from one of the plants, the soil cool and damp beneath his fingertips. It was a habit, tending the plants before he faced the world. The garden had been his quiet post for years, a place where he could work with his hands and watch something grow. It reminded him of times when days were counted not in hours but in the steady work of surviving, and of making something worth protecting. By the time he returned inside, the coffee had cooled enough to drink. He sat at the small kitchen table, its wood worn at the edges, and unfolded the morning newspaper. The headlines told of things moving fast and loud, stock markets rising and falling, politics boiling over, but Christopher's eyes lingered only on the smaller print. A story about a local bridge repair, an obituary for a man he had once served alongside, though few would know it from the simple paragraph. After breakfast, he dressed for the day. A pressed shirt, plain slacks, his well-worn jacket. The cane leaned by the door, its polished handle catching a shard of sunlight. It had been a gift from an old friend who had passed before his time. Christopher took it in hand as he stepped outside, locking the door behind him with a soft click. At the bus stop, a few others waited. A young man with headphones swayed to music only he could hear. A middle-aged woman tapped her phone screen impatiently. When Christopher reached the bench, the young man shifted only slightly, not quite enough to make space. Christopher remained standing. The morning traffic hummed in the distance, the air carrying the faint scent of diesel and warm asphalt. The bus arrived with a sigh of brakes and a gust of exhaust. Inside, the seats were nearly full. Christopher found a place near the front, settling carefully, his cane resting against his leg. The ride was quiet, save for the occasional rattle over uneven pavement. Faces came and went, none lingering. When the bus finally stopped near the brick-fronted service office, Christopher stepped down onto the pavement and adjusted his jacket. He had a task to see through today, a matter of pension paperwork that had wound its way through too many hands without finding resolution. It was not the sort of errand anyone looked forward to, but he carried with him the patience of someone who had seen far worse delays. As he approached the building, the faint buzz of fluorescent lights seemed to reach him even before he stepped through the door. Inside, the air was cool, the walls lined with posters explaining forms and procedures in small, tidy print. People stood in loose clusters, the sound of murmured conversations blending with the mechanical chatter of printers. Christopher moved toward the counter, his place in line already set in his mind. It was, for the moment, an ordinary morning. The service office had its own kind of rhythm. Numbers blinked on a small screen above the counter, the call of each new turn softened by the low hum of air conditioning. Christopher took his place in line, the cane in his right hand tapping lightly against the tile with each slow step forward. Ahead, a clerk scanned forms with a look of weary detachment, sliding them back across the counter without lifting her gaze. He waited patiently, his eyes moving over the people around him. A young mother juggled a restless toddler on her hip while thumbing through a stack of papers. Two men in work boots spoke quietly in the corner, their conversation pausing whenever their number edged closer to being called. Across the room, a security guard leaned against the far wall, scanning the crowd with bored eyes. The first slight came quickly. A man 2 places ahead in line stepped sideways without looking, his shoulder brushing Christopher's with enough force to shift his balance. No glance back, no word of apology. Christopher steadied himself, adjusting his grip on the cane. It was nothing, really, the kind of thing that happened every day in crowded places. Still, it left a faint ripple in the calm he carried with him. A few minutes later, as the line shuffled forward, a voice rose from somewhere behind him. "Let's go. Some of us have things to do today." The tone was sharp, impatient, the words falling like stones in the still air. Christopher didn't turn. He had learned long ago that meeting such voices with silence was often the better choice. The clerk at the counter called the next number. A man in a leather jacket hurried forward, speaking before he even reached the desk. The exchange was brisk, transactional, over in less than a minute. Christopher stepped forward with the others, his gaze fixed ahead. When it was nearly his turn, the faint scent of cologne reached him. Sharp, artificial, cutting through the cooler air. It came from the tall figure now standing behind him, close enough that Christopher could hear the steady rhythm of his breathing. The man's stance was wide, his presence deliberate. The clerk finished with the customer at the counter and looked toward Christopher. Next, he took a step forward, the cane clicking softly against the tile. That was when the voice behind him came again, this time closer, sharper. "You're holding up the line." Christopher's jaw tightened. He placed his papers on the counter and spoke to the clerk in an even tone, ignoring the comment. But the voice behind him didn't fade. "You hear me? I said you're holding up the line." The clerk's eyes flickered between Christopher and the man behind him, uncertainty creeping into her expression. The room seemed to shift, the low hum of conversation dipping just enough for the tension to settle in. Christopher kept his voice level. "I have business here, same as you." A pause followed, the kind of pause that carried weight, the kind that meant this moment was not going to pass quietly. The man behind Christopher stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the counter. He was taller by several inches, his frame filling the space with a kind of deliberate intrusion. The maroon hoodie he wore was creased and stretched at the seams, his hands buried deep in the pockets as though holding something back, or holding something in. "You don't belong up here," he said, his voice pitched low but carrying far enough to draw glances from nearby. "People like you take forever." The clerk's fingers hesitated over the keyboard. Her eyes dropped to the papers in front of Christopher, then back up to his face. She looked as if she might say something, but the moment slipped past. Christopher didn't turn around. "I've been waiting my turn," he replied, his words clipped, almost formal. The man let out a sharp laugh, not the kind born of humor, but of disbelief mixed with contempt. Your turn? I've seen old guys like you in here before. You think the world owes you something? The comment drew a small stir from the line. A couple of people exchanged glances. One man looked down, fidgeting with the zipper of his jacket. Others seemed to pretend they hadn't heard. Christopher kept his shoulders square, his gaze fixed on the clerk. But his grip on the cane tightened, the polished handle pressing into the palm of his hand. From the far side of the room, a middle-aged woman in a denim jacket spoke up. "Sir, he was here before you." The man's head turned sharply toward her. "Mind your business." The woman's mouth opened as if to reply, but she stopped, shaking her head as though she had decided the cost of speaking again was too high. The line shuffled forward by half a step, yet the air felt heavier now, the space around Christopher shrinking. The man's presence was like a pressure against the back of his neck. "Let's make this quick," the man muttered. "I've got places to be." Christopher placed a document on the counter, sliding it toward the clerk. "This will take as long as it needs to," he said evenly. The man let out a sharp, impatient breath. Then, in a voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, he said, "You're useless now. Just move." The words landed with a thud in the room's stillness. A few people glanced toward the door, as if already wondering how to remove themselves from what was unfolding. It was then that the clerk, looking increasingly uneasy, reached for the phone at her desk. "I'll call a supervisor," she said softly, not meeting Christopher's eyes. The clerk's voice, small and uncertain, carried just enough for those nearby to hear. "I'll call a supervisor." She reached for the phone, the receiver trembling slightly in her hand. The man behind Christopher leaned on the counter beside him, his arm brushing past as if claiming the space. "Good. Maybe someone can get him out of the way." Christopher's jaw tightened. He could feel the shift in the room, eyes on him, the silence between words stretching longer. The air was cool from the humming vents above, yet a faint heat rose at the back of his neck. From the corner of the room, the security guard straightened, pushing off the wall. He started toward the counter, his steps unhurried but deliberate. The man in the hoodie caught sight of him and stood a little taller, as though daring him to speak. The guard stopped short, his expression unreadable. "What's the problem here?" The man answered before Christopher could speak. "The problem is he's slowing everyone down. I've got places to be." Christopher's voice was steady. "I've been waiting my turn, that's all." The guard's eyes moved between them, then landed on the clerk, who was still holding the receiver. She hesitated, then spoke into it in a quiet, clipped tone, asking for a supervisor to come to the front. A woman near the back of the line muttered something under her breath. The man in front of her turned to glare. The ripple of discomfort spread again, some choosing to look away, others drawn in like spectators at the edge of a fire. When the supervisor arrived, a tall man in a pale blue shirt and neatly pressed trousers, he carried himself with the weary authority of someone used to making decisions quickly. His eyes swept the scene. "What's going on here?" The man in the hoodie spoke up again, his voice pitched for the room. "He's holding everyone up. I told him to step aside so the rest of us can get through." Christopher turned slightly toward the supervisor. "I've been in line. I'm here to finish my business." The supervisor looked between them, his brow furrowing. Then he spoke the words that pulled the air a little tighter. "Sir, why don't you step aside until we get this sorted?" For the first time, Christopher's eyes left the clerk and met the supervisor's gaze. There was no anger there, only the deep, steady weight of a man who had heard those words before, in other places, from other mouths. He did not move. The room seemed to hold its breath. The silence that followed the supervisor's words felt heavier than the noise had been. A chair creaked somewhere near the back of the room. The hum of the air conditioner seemed louder, pressing into the stillness. Christopher's fingers rested lightly on the handle of his cane, the curve fitting into his palm as if it belonged there. He had no intention of stepping aside, not because of stubbornness, but because the principle of the thing had been carved into him long before this morning. The man in the hoodie shifted closer, his voice carrying over Christopher's shoulder. "You heard him. Move." The supervisor frowned slightly. but didn't correct him. Instead, he addressed Christopher again. "Sir, if you could just—" The words were cut short by the denim-jacketed woman from earlier. She stepped forward, her voice sharper than before. "This is wrong. He's been here longer than half of us. Let him be." It was the first voice in the room that carried both firmness and fairness, but it didn't last. The man turned on her, his tone laced with scorn. "Stay out of it." The supervisor raised a hand in a half-hearted gesture toward calming things down, but no clear decision followed. The woman hesitated, glancing toward Christopher as though weighing whether to stand her ground. In the end, she stepped back, muttering under her breath. The man's grin was quick, sharp, almost satisfied. "See? Nobody's on your side." A murmur moved through the line, some voices low and sympathetic, others impatient. A young man with a baseball cap tugged low over his brow shifted uncomfortably, his foot tapping against the floor in an uneven rhythm. The clerk busied herself with a stack of papers, her eyes fixed downward. Christopher adjusted his stance, setting both feet firmly on the tile. His breathing was steady, but there was a stillness about him now, the kind that precedes a storm. The man spoke again, louder this time, making sure his words carried to the far side of the room. "You're useless now. Just move already." It was then the faint scrape of his cane against the tile cut through the air. A sound small enough to be swallowed by the room, yet sharp enough to echo in Christopher's mind. It was not the sound of a cane anymore. It was the crunch of gravel under boots. The fluorescent light seemed to dim, the cool air thickened, and the scent of paper and ink was replaced by the heavy, wet air of another place, another time. The crunch of gravel became the crunch of stones under combat boots, swallowed by the endless hiss of rain. Christopher was no longer in a cooled, fluorescent-lit room. The air was thick and warm, heavy with the metallic tang of blood and the sharp scent of wet earth. Night lay over the jungle like a weight. The sky above was a low, black ceiling that released the rain in sheets, each drop stinging as it struck skin. His uniform clung to him, soaked through, the fabric dragging at his limbs. The mud pulled at every step, sucking at his boots, slowing him as though the earth itself wanted to hold him there. He could hear them, not just his men, but the ones firing from somewhere in the darkness ahead. The sharp, snapping cracks of rifles, the occasional deeper thud of mortar, the distant, haunting sound of someone shouting in pain. A young soldier, barely more than a boy, crouched low beside him, eyes wide with the shock of finding himself here, now, in this place he had only imagined before. His hands trembled as he tried to reload, the magazine slipping once, then twice. "Stay with me," Christopher said, his voice steady despite the chaos. The boy looked at him, panic breaking through whatever discipline had brought him this far. "Don't leave me!" A mortar hit close enough to lift the ground beneath them. The air filled with the smell of burnt powder and the choking dust of shattered earth. Christopher felt the shrapnel tear into his leg, the heat of it searing through muscle. He forced himself upright, dragging the boy with him, half carrying, half pulling him toward the shadowed outline of a trench line. The rain blurred everything, running into his eyes, pooling in the hollows of the boy's helmet. They stumbled, slipped, but did not stop. Bullets cracked overhead, some close enough to stir the air beside his face. When they reached cover, Christopher pushed the boy down into the mud, shielding him with his own body for a moment longer before finally easing away. "We don't leave our own," he said, the words carrying not just to the boy, but to himself, to the part of him that needed to believe it would always be true. The rain kept falling, the sound like static over the pounding in his ears. Somewhere far away, a voice was calling his name. Not here, not now, but in a room filled with light and the smell of paper. The crunch of gravel faded. The cane was in his hand again. The service office came back into focus. The man behind him was still there, still waiting for him to move. The last fragments of the jungle slipped away, leaving only the chill of the air-conditioned room and the distant hum of the fluorescent lights. Christopher stood exactly where he had been, his cane planted firmly, the polished handle warm in his grip. His leg ached in a familiar way, not from the hours of standing, but from the memory that had just tightened its hold. The man behind him shifted impatiently. "What's it gonna be, old man?" His tone was different now, louder, carrying for everyone to hear. The supervisor, still standing off to one side, looked as if he might repeat his earlier instruction, but before he could speak, another sound cut through the space, measured footsteps on tile. It was not the shuffle of an office worker or the heavy tread of the security guard. This was precise, balanced, each step deliberate, the heel striking first, followed by the quiet roll of the foot. Heads began to turn toward the source. Polished black shoes, navy blue trousers with a sharp scarlet stripe down the seam, a jacket pressed so sharply it seemed to carry its own gravity. Brass glinted in the artificial light. Captain George Coleman walked into the room with the kind of presence that drew eyes before words. His gaze swept the space, reading it in a single pass. The drawn shoulders of the clerk, the wary stillness of the woman in denim, the defiance in the man standing too close to Christopher's back. He didn't raise his voice. "That's enough." The man in the hoodie turned, his brows pulling together. "Who are you supposed to be?" Coleman didn't answer him immediately. He stepped closer, his boots clicking softly on the tile, stopping just beside Christopher. The scent of pressed wool and faint leather replaced the stale air between them. "Permission to speak on your behalf, Sergeant Major?" His eyes were on Christopher, the question more than courtesy. It was respect, offered before action. Christopher studied him for a moment, then gave a single nod. Coleman turned toward the room, his voice carrying in a way that didn't need volume to command attention. "This man is Christopher White. He served in the United States Army for 32 years. I know because I've read his record, and because men I trust have spoken his name with honor." The room quieted. Even the supervisor seemed unsure of where to look. Coleman's gaze swept the crowd. "While some of you have been impatient for minutes, this man has waited a lifetime for the recognition he deserves." Captain Coleman's words seemed to hang in the air, heavier than the hum of the vents or the shuffle of feet. His voice did not rise, but it carried, a tone sharpened by years of issuing orders in places where hesitation meant loss. "In 1971, he continued, he was deep in the jungles of Vietnam. His patrol was caught under fire. He carried a wounded soldier to safety through mud and rain, taking shrapnel to the leg. He did not stop. He did not quit. And the man he saved? He lived to see his grandchildren born because of what Sergeant Major White did that night." Christopher stood silent, his gaze fixed forward. The memories pressed at the edges of his mind, but he did not speak. Coleman took a step forward, his eyes sweeping the room. He trained hundreds of young soldiers over the course of his career. He stood watch on nights when most of you slept under a safe roof. And when his service was over, he came home and kept serving, in his community, quietly, without looking for thanks. The woman in denim near the back shifted her weight, her arms uncrossing. The young man in the baseball cap removed it, holding it loosely at his side. The clerk's fingers stilled over the keyboard. Coleman glanced at the man in the hoodie, not a glare, not a challenge, but a look so steady it left no space for rebuttal. And today, he is being asked to move aside, to wait, as though his time is less valuable than yours. As though his years of service can be brushed away because they do not fit your schedule. No one spoke. The quiet was different now, not the awkward stillness of before, but something heavier, more deliberate. Coleman turned back to Christopher. "Sergeant Major, I think it's time they all knew who was standing in front of them." Christopher inclined his head just slightly, the faintest acknowledgement. The weight in the room shifted again, the tide beginning to turn. Captain Coleman faced the room, his posture unshaken, his words deliberate. "You have the choice right now to recognize a man who has given more than most of us will ever be asked to give. You can look away, pretend this moment doesn't matter, or you can stand." The man in the hoodie stayed still, his jaw tight. His eyes darted toward the crowd as if searching for silent allies. None came. From the far corner, the young man with the baseball cap moved first. He stood, cap still in hand, his back straightening. For a moment he seemed unsure of what to do with his hands. Then he lifted them in a sharp salute. The gesture rippled outward. A middle-aged man in work boots rose next, removing his own cap. The woman in denim straightened, her chin lifting, her eyes fixed on Christopher. The mother with the small boy whispered something to her son, and together they stood. The boy's hand was small, his salute imperfect, but the effort carried a quiet weight that drew a lump to more than one throat. The sound in the room shifted, the scrape of chairs, the shuffle of feet. Even the security guard moved from his post, standing taller, his hand raised in salute. Coleman's gaze returned to Christopher. "Sergeant Major White, this is your moment." Christopher's eyes moved slowly over the room, meeting the gaze of those who now stood for him. His breath drew in deep, steady. Then, with a quiet dignity, he straightened his shoulders and returned the salute. The movement precise, steady, unwavering. It was a small thing, just the lift of a hand. But in that moment, it felt as though the whole room had shifted its axis. The room seemed suspended in that silent exchange. Christopher's salute held steady, the crowd's eyes fixed on him. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed softly, the only sound in a space that had gone utterly still. The man in the hoodie, who had loomed so large moments ago, now seemed smaller somehow. His gaze darted away from Christopher's eyes, landing on the floor. His jaw worked as though there were words he might say, but none came. The swagger had gone from his stance. Coleman let the silence breathe. He knew the weight of such pauses, how they gave space for pride to take root, for shame to settle, for truths to be understood without another word spoken. A few people began to lower their hands, but most held the salute a moment longer, as though reluctant to let the moment end. The little boy at his mother's side looked up at Christopher with the wide-eyed awe children reserve for heroes. Finally, Christopher lowered his arm. His hand brushed the brim of his cap, adjusting it with a small, practiced movement. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice low, steady. Coleman took a half-step closer to the man in the hoodie. "Now you know," he said, not with anger, but with an unshakable finality. The man's head dipped slightly. "I didn't know," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "You do now," Coleman replied. The crowd began to shift again, not back into the idle restlessness of before, but into something softer. Conversation started low and slow, like a stream finding its way over stones. The tension that had held the room in its grip was replaced with something else entirely: respect, and perhaps a touch of gratitude. The supervisor was the first to speak once the room began to stir. He stepped forward, his voice clearing in the quiet. "Mr. White, I owe you an apology." The words were deliberate, not rushed. This should never have happened. Christopher gave a small nod, not seeking more. The clerk behind the counter straightened the stack of papers before her, then pushed them gently toward him. "Let's get your paperwork finished," she said, her tone different now, steadier, more careful. In the days that followed, the service office made changes. A sign was posted near the entrance, written in clean, bold letters. Veterans served first. Not just a policy, but a statement, one that would stand long after the echo of that morning faded. A photograph found its way into the local newspaper. It showed Christopher standing beside Captain Coleman, both of them looking directly into the lens, their handshake firm. The caption beneath was simple: "Respect given where it was due." The man in the hoodie was seen again weeks later, but not in the same way. A small group had gathered at a veterans fundraiser on the edge of town. He was there, stacking chairs, moving crates of bottled water, speaking to no one, asking for no recognition. Coleman visited Christopher once, not long after the incident. They sat in the garden, the rows of tomato plants between them. No ceremony, no speeches, just two men who understood more than they spoke. When Coleman left, Christopher remained outside a while longer, the evening settling in around him. The hum of cicadas filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of the earth he had worked that morning. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Let us know where you are watching from, and if this moment brought back memories you carry with you. The best way to honor their memory is to keep listening. Click on the suggested video now, and we will walk together through another untold chapter of courage and sacrifice.